For 25 years, a single painting sat wrapped in darkness, hidden away in a storage room deep inside Windsor Castle. And then, last week, two members of the royal family carried it back into the light. What Princess Anne helped Prince William pull off had been quietly taking shape for a quarter of a century. And the moment it happened, the reaction inside those walls was so sudden and so explosive that Camilla was left utterly speechless. She ran straight to Charles, demanding he put a stop to it, only to realize she had zero authority to prevent any of it. But here's the thing. The portrait itself was not what shattered her. William had engineered the entire operation. Every legal requirement, every institutional regulation satisfied, all of it structured so that no one on earth could ever reverse what he had done. And then Anne did something at the very end that was never part of that plan. Something nobody had arranged and nobody had anticipated. And it hit Camilla harder than the painting ever could. When the story leaked, it shocked the nation. And from what I have gathered, it stunned William as well. We are going to get there, so stay with me. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss where this ultimately leads. Quick introduction before we dive in. My name is Harold. I dedicate my time to digging through everything that circulates around this family. The records, the inquiry files, the reporting that was quietly buried before anyone could finish asking the right questions. What you are about to hear is my interpretation of how the pieces fit together, not a sanitized palace briefing. Stay through to the end because the final 30 seconds of this story come down to 5 words, spoken in a room with 2 women standing in it. So let me walk you through exactly what took place. William retrieved Princess Diana's official portrait from the storage room, where it had been gathering dust for more than 2 decades, and positioned it precisely where it was always meant to be, on the Hall of Matriarchs wall at Windsor Castle, right next to Queen Elizabeth. If you are unfamiliar with that name, the Hall of Matriarchs is a designated wall inside Windsor, reserved for the women who genuinely shaped and defined this monarchy. It is the most sacred ceremonial space in the entire residence. Camilla had no warning whatsoever. She saw it, and by every account, she was absolutely stunned. She went directly to Charles and instructed him to have it removed immediately. And what Charles did next sent shockwaves through the entire palace. I will get to that as well, because his response is the second most devastating moment in this entire story. But first, you need to grasp the wound underneath everything, because nothing that happened makes any sense without it. There exists a portrait of Princess Diana that most people have never seen up close, and the account of where that painting has been resting for the past 25 years is going to make your stomach turn. It was commissioned during one of the most celebrated chapters of her entire public life. She was at the absolute peak of everything. Her beauty, her warmth, that rare quality she possessed that no royal before her had ever achieved. The ability to make ordinary people feel acknowledged and valued by someone who had absolutely no obligation to even glance their way. People who were present when Diana first laid eyes on the completed portrait recall that she stood before it for a considerable amount of time without uttering a single word. Let that sink in for a moment, because that is a very particular kind of quiet. That is what happens to a person when something captures precisely who they are, and they were completely unprepared for it. That portrait was intended for the Hall of Matriarchs. Diana never witnessed it hung there. She passed away before it could happen. And following her death, the portrait was quietly pulled from consideration, covered up, and placed into palace storage, where it remained in darkness for over 20 years, while the world beyond those walls continued to plaster her face across magazine covers and memorial stamps and the covers of every book written about the modern royal family. Now, this is where you need to slow down, because what was unfolding inside that building in the days following her death is an entirely different story from the one the nation was watching on their television screens. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, and the world mourned openly and loudly. You remember the seas of flowers piled outside the gates. You remember the throngs of people standing in the rain because they had nowhere else to go. On the other side of those gates, it was quieter, and honestly, it was far uglier. Within hours of her death being confirmed, the earliest calls made from inside the palace were not expressions of grief. Royal insiders have reported for years that among the very first matters raised in those hours was whether Diana had any crown jewelry in her possession in Paris. Someone wanted to account for the property. The effort to reclaim it began before the British public had even been informed their princess was gone. And while that was unfolding, Camilla was already making her moves. Camilla had spent years as the concealed woman, the one Charles visited in secret while married to someone else, the one Diana privately referred to as the Rottweiler, because Diana understood better than anyone alive precisely what this woman was doing to her marriage and precisely how effective she was at doing it. Now Diana was gone, and Camilla began moving through the palace rooms that Diana had once called home. And she did not simply move in. Stop and consider that distinction because it matters enormously. Moving in is what anyone does. Camilla obliterated. Diana had kept fresh flowers throughout the spaces she inhabited, arrangements she had personally selected because that was the kind of small, intimate detail she cared about. Camilla ordered them removed and burned, not replaced, burned. There is a fundamental difference between discarding something and setting it ablaze, and everyone who worked in that household understood exactly which one they were being instructed to do. Then the bedroom, the room where Diana had slept, the room where she had cradled her boys, the room where she had wept alone at night and written privately when there was no one left to confide in. Camilla ordered that room sealed permanently, and I keep returning to this detail because of what it reveals about her. She did not want to sleep there herself. She had no use for the room whatsoever. She simply ensured that no one else would ever sleep in it again. She wanted it shut away like something disgraceful, like a blemish you conceal with furniture instead of cleaning. Diana's personal belongings were packed into boxes and relocated. Her image began vanishing from the most prominent ceremonial spaces within the royal residences. And it did not occur all at once, which is the part that made it work. No one ever stood up and declared that the photographs were being removed. One frame relocated to a smaller room. Then another shifted to a corridor. Then a third simply ceased to exist anywhere. And by the time anyone recognized the pattern, there was nothing remaining to point at. That is how you erase a person from a building without ever putting a single instruction in writing. You do it in fragments small enough that objecting to any individual one makes you appear unreasonable. And the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor, that wall of honor reserved for the women who constructed this institution, never received her portrait at all. For more than 20 years, the most adored royal woman of the modern era was absent from her own family's wall because one woman found her presence intolerable. Foreign heads of state passed that wall, prime ministers passed it, her own sons passed it at every family gathering throughout their adult lives and counted the faces and knew precisely whose was absent. Now let me bring you to the boy at the center of all of this, because everything that occurred last week flows directly through him. William was 15 years old when he marched behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London on the 6th of September, 1997. He walked in silence, dressed in a dark suit, in front of the entire world, his face utterly composed. And people forget that he was not walking behind that coffin as a naive child who failed to comprehend what had befallen his parents. He was a child who already knew his father had been carrying on an affair with another woman for years, because Diana had sat him down and told him personally. She told him there were 3 people in that marriage. She said that was why the family had fallen apart. If that phrase rings a bell, it is because she expressed a version of it publicly on national television during the Panorama interview in November of 1995, and the entire nation heard it at the same moment her sons did. His younger brother learned the truth in an entirely different manner. And honestly, this is one of the most heartbreaking details in the whole narrative. Harry was seated beside his mother watching a television discussion about the monarchy. Camilla's name appeared on the screen, and he looked at Diana and asked her who that person was. And Diana had to explain it to her youngest son right then and there, in the middle of a broadcast, with absolutely no preparation and no gentle way to approach it. But the most crushing thing William would ever discover about what was done to his mother did not come from a conversation at all. It came from a letter. In October of 1995, 2 years before she died, Diana composed a note to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon. And in that note, she stated that she believed her husband was plotting to have her killed in a staged car accident. She wrote about brake failure and serious head injury. She wrote that it would leave him free to move forward. She wrote that Camilla was nothing but a decoy, and that she herself was being exploited by the man in every conceivable way. 2 years after she committed those words to paper, Diana died in a car crash inside a tunnel in Paris. That note was delivered to police following her death and then sat untouched for 6 years before it finally made its way to Scotland Yard. 6 years. Let that register for a moment, because it is the detail in this entire saga that I cannot move past. A woman writes down that she believes her husband is plotting to kill her in a car. She hands it to her lawyer. She dies in a car 2 years later. The lawyer delivers the note to the police, and then it sits in a drawer for 6 years while the country conducts inquests and prints theories and debates seatbelts. No one has ever provided a satisfactory explanation for those 6 years. Charles was eventually questioned about it privately at St. James's Palace as part of the inquiry that followed. Now, I want to be straightforward with you here because this is the point where a lot of channels start pushing a narrative. That inquiry examined the note and examined the crash and concluded there was no evidence of any conspiracy whatsoever. I am not standing here asserting that Diana was correct about what she wrote. I am telling you that she wrote it. I am telling you she was frightened enough of the man she had married to put it in writing and hand it to a lawyer. And I am telling you that her 15-year-old son eventually grew up and read it. Pay attention to what he does with the remainder of his life, because that letter sits beneath every single choice he makes. William and Harry were not aware of the full contents of that note for years, and when William finally comprehended what his mother had been recording in the final 2 years of her life, and then turned around and observed what had been done to her memory within the palace walls following her death, something inside him calcified completely. It has never softened, not even once. He watched Camilla occupy the rooms his mother had lived in. He watched portraits of his mother come down from walls. He watched the Hall of Matriarchs stand with a void where Diana should have been, year after year, at every state occasion, at every family gathering. At every moment in his life when he walked past that wall and counted the faces, and in public he kept his expression perfectly still, the way he had learned to do at 15. On the inside, the rage was consuming him. At 16, he finally cracked. He pulled aside someone close to him and he let everything pour out at once. He said Camilla had sunk her claws into his father and never released her grip for a single second. He said that was the reason his mother was dead, because Diana had been expelled from her own family, stripped of her protection, pushed further and further out until there was no one left standing near her. And she ended up alone and unprotected in a Paris tunnel in the middle of the night. A 16-year-old boy spoke those words about the woman who was by then residing in his mother's home. And then he carried every single one of them silently, without repeating them to anyone who mattered, for the next 25 years. And that is the part people fail to appreciate about William. And I think they fail to appreciate it because he is so skilled at being gracious in a receiving line. He was 16 when he determined exactly what he believed had happened to his mother, and he has not altered his opinion about a single word of it since. He simply grasped something at 16 that most people never grasp at all, which is that speaking a truth at the wrong moment yields nothing except the satisfaction of having spoken it. So he shook her hand at Christmas. He posed beside her in photographs. He publicly supported her elevation when the time arrived, on camera, with a composed expression. And he bided his time until the day he possessed the authority to act, and he never once allowed her to see it approaching. But William was not the only person in that family carrying a wound tied to Camilla. There was one other, and hers ran deeper than his, and hers began long before Diana ever entered the picture. That person is Princess Anne. Before Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles was in a serious romantic relationship with Anne. Not a fleeting encounter, not a rumor someone fabricated after the fact. They were close enough that marriage was being discussed between them, and the royal family shut it down. Andrew was Catholic. Anne, as a senior member of the Church of England, was not permitted to marry him. So she stepped aside, because that is what she has done her entire life every time the institution has required it of her, and because she genuinely had no alternative in the matter. Within a very short period, Camilla moved in and Andrew proposed to her, and Anne sat in the pews at their wedding in 1973 and watched it unfold. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the bedrock of everything that followed. A young woman in her early 20s, sitting in a church, watching the man she had been discussing marrying wed someone else, having been told she was not permitted to be the one standing up there and doing it, in public, in a hat, with photographers outside, with her face arranged into precisely the expression the institution demanded of her that afternoon. She did not create a scene. She has never created a scene about anything in her life. She sat through the ceremony, she attended the reception, and she has never in 50 years spoken one public word about what that day cost her. That is the woman we are dealing with here. Not someone who lashes out, someone who catalogs things away. And then the woman who took him spent the next several decades as a hidden mistress who dismantled Anne's brother's marriage, shattered Diana in front of the entire world, and ultimately walked into Buckingham Palace wearing a crown. Royal biographers have written for years that Camilla was deeply unsettled by Anne, that Anne's frostiness toward her was deeply uncomfortable to endure, and that whatever sat between those two women from 1973 was never resolved and was never going to be. And I think it is worth being precise about what that means in practice, because it is not shouting, and it is not a feud anyone could capture on camera. It is a woman who says good morning and then says nothing else for the remainder of the day. It is being seated correctly at every dinner for 50 years and never once being addressed as family at any of them. It is the particular coldness of someone who is never rude enough to give you anything you could lodge a complaint about. Following the coronation in May of 2023, Anne reportedly confronted Camilla at a private luncheon, looked her squarely in the eye, and told her something that has been echoed around that household ever since, that she is not the queen, that she is the king's wife. Anne has allegedly never bowed to her, not once. The story goes that she asked Queen Elizabeth personally for permission to be exempt from that particular protocol, and that the Queen granted it without much of a discussion. And through all of it, Anne watched Diana being erased. She watched the portrait vanish into storage. She watched that wall remain empty for 20 years, while the family released statements about legacy and remembrance. And she carried every single piece of it in the way that Anne carries things, which is silently and permanently and without ever giving anyone the satisfaction of witnessing it. So you had two people inside that family who both wanted precisely the same thing for entirely different reasons and who had both been waiting a very long time to obtain it. They wanted Diana back on that wall. And then came the night when the waiting was finally over. Now, William had spent years preparing this, and the preparation is the part that reveals what kind of man is going to be running this country. He did not burst into a gallery with a painting tucked under his arm. He held meetings with curators about portrait placement protocol. He examined the historical records on every previous placement on that wall, stretching back decades, so he could cite precedent for every single step. He made absolutely certain that every institutional regulation was followed to the letter, so that once the portrait was hanging, there was no legal avenue for anyone on earth to contest it or reverse it. He had been executing a 20-year chess game inside his own family. This was the maneuver he had been constructing toward the entire time. And in the previous video on this channel, I covered what Anne did in that corridor outside the throne room, the day she dismissed Camilla's final plea and escorted Catherine straight through those doors, while the entire nation examined the photograph over breakfast the following morning. Many of you came into the comments underneath it, asking me the same question. You wanted to know what Anne and William are truly capable of when the two of them cease operating independently and begin operating in concert. This is that video, because the night before it happened, William picked up the phone and contacted his aunt. The call was brief. Neither of them required a lengthy conversation, and both of them had been waiting a very long time for that conversation to occur at all. Anne said she could not wait to witness the expression on her face. She said it was long overdue. She said Diana deserved to come home, and William said she comes home tomorrow. That was it. The call concluded. Two people in two separate buildings, both of whom had spent decades maintaining perfectly composed expressions in public rooms, agreeing in roughly 30 seconds to execute the one thing nobody in that household had ever dared to attempt. And Camilla had no idea any of it had transpired. She had spent 25 years convinced she had triumphed. And honestly, why would she not believe that? She had the ring, she had the title, she had the crown placed on her head at Westminster, and she had the walls of that palace arranged exactly the way she desired them. Every trace of the other woman was sealed in a box somewhere or concealed behind a locked door. She was about to discover how mistaken she was about all of it. So let me walk you into the night Diana came home, because the planning surrounding it is genuinely remarkable to examine. William's team had scheduled Camilla for an engagement outside London that day. That was not a coincidence, and it was not fortune. Someone sat down with a calendar and placed her on a train out of the city deliberately, to remove her from the building and keep her away from it until the entire operation was finished and completely irreversible. While she was absent, the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor was closed. Not to everyone, but to nearly everyone. A small number of trusted staff were granted access. Individuals who had been personally vetted, individuals who understood precisely what they were about to participate in, and could be trusted not to make a phone call about it. Nothing appeared on the official royal diary. No press release was composed or drafted or held in reserve. There was no intention to inform anyone at all. This was taking place in total silence, which is how you know it was never about making a declaration. It was about completing the task. In the early evening, the portrait of Princess Diana was transported into the Hall of Matriarchs. It had been resting in protective wrapping inside a storage room for over 20 years, and the people who have described that evening keep returning to the same detail, which is the manner in which the staff handled it as they brought it inside. They moved deliberately with it. They moved with it the way you move with something that has already suffered once and does not deserve to suffer again. And Princess Anne was present, not sending word, not receiving a report afterward. She was standing in that room in person because she had demanded to oversee the placement herself, and she was not going to permit anyone else to do it for her. Here is the thing about that, and I want you to hold on to it. Nothing in William's plan required her presence. The curators had everything under control. The protocol had been cleared. The precedent had been verified and rechecked for months. She could have remained exactly where she was and read about it the following morning like everyone else. She came regardless. She had waited 50 years, and she was going to witness it with her own eyes. The protective wrapping was removed slowly, and for the first time in more than 2 decades, Diana's portrait was fully visible inside the walls of Windsor Castle, in the room where it had always been intended to reside. And I have reflected on that moment extensively because of who was standing in the room to witness it. Anne recognized that face when it was young. She was part of the family before Diana arrived. She was present through the wedding and the marriage and the collapse and the funeral. And she observed the entire trajectory of it from approximately 4 feet away. So that wrapping came off in front of a woman who was not gazing at a national icon or a magazine cover at all. She was gazing at a girl she had watched get destroyed by the very institution she has devoted her entire life to. The frame was prepared. The placement was measured and confirmed and measured again, because on a wall like that, a single inch carries weight, and everyone in the room understood it. And within 90 minutes of that portrait entering the gallery, Diana's face was on the wall. She was positioned directly beside the late Queen Elizabeth, 2 women side by side, one who reigned for 70 years and one who never received the opportunity to reign at all, exactly where the 2 of them should have been standing together from the very start. The room fell remarkably quiet after it was completed. Multiple individuals who were present have said the same thing, which is that no one spoke for a while. They did not offer congratulations. No one delivered a speech. They stood there in a closed gallery inside an empty castle and looked at a painting that should never have departed from it. And then Princess Anne spoke. She said it quietly, almost to herself, the way people do when a sentence has been resting in their chest for so long that it escapes regardless of whether they intended to vocalize it. Staff standing nearby heard it clearly enough to repeat it afterward. She said that Diana belongs here, and then she said that she always did. Not that she deserves to be here, not that it is about time someone took action. Belongs in the present tense. As though the past 25 years had been a clerical error that someone had finally gotten around to rectifying. That is it. That is the entirety of it. No speech, no statement, no line crafted for a press office. Simply the truth spoken aloud in a room that had been deliberately silent about it for 25 years, by a woman who has spent her entire life not saying things. And I want you to comprehend the magnitude of what was actually being corrected in that room. Diana was the most cherished royal of her entire generation. She filled stadiums. She lined streets. She made the entire world weep at her funeral in a manner that had never occurred before and has not occurred since. And if you were alive that week, you remember exactly where you were standing. And her own family kept her portrait locked inside a storage room for over 2 decades because one woman found her presence threatening. That woman was asleep across London that night. She had no idea. She did not know the wrapping had been taken off. She did not know the frame had been mounted. And she did not know that her stepson and her sister-in-law had been standing in a gallery at Windsor a few hours earlier, gazing at a face she had spent 25 years eliminating from the building. Now, there is something you need to understand about how terrified Camilla had always been of precisely this moment, because it did not begin last week. Camilla finally met William face-to-face for the first time at Clarence House, and one royal biographer reported that she was trembling beforehand, that she required a drink to steady herself before she could enter the room. She was physically shaking at the prospect of confronting a teenage boy, and people have offered all manner of explanations for that over the years, but the simplest one is usually the correct one. She knew exactly what she had done to his mother. She knew that he knew, and she possessed absolutely no defense to offer him, not a single sentence, because there is no version of that exchange where she emerges from it looking well. She had been frightened of William since he was 16 years old, but she had never once imagined he would do this. That the boy who walked silently behind his mother's coffin would spend the next 25 years quietly, methodically, patiently constructing toward a single evening where he would restore his mother to the wall she was always owed and execute it so meticulously that not a single person could remove her again. That evening, Camilla returned from her engagement outside London. She went to sleep in the palace she had spent 25 years redesigning and reorganizing and scrubbing clean of another woman's presence. She slept, and a few miles away in the Hall of Matriarchs, Diana looked out from the wall beside the Queen. The following morning, Camilla was going to awaken and walk directly into the worst day she had experienced in decades. She simply did not know it yet. Camilla arrived back at Windsor the next morning, anticipating a completely ordinary day. A schedule, a car, a series of engagements, the usual routine. She walked inside. She received the news, and the reaction was instantaneous, and it was visceral. She did not collect herself. She did not retreat somewhere private to process it and re-emerge with a composed expression. Everyone who was in her vicinity that morning describes the same thing, which is that she froze completely with rage, standing right there in the corridor in front of household staff who suddenly discovered they had urgent business elsewhere. Then she began issuing commands. She ordered the portrait removed immediately. She demanded an emergency meeting with William. She insisted that Charles intervene on her behalf and handle it. And she demanded a complete explanation from every member of palace staff who had been involved in transporting that painting into the gallery. Every one of those demands was denied. Every single one. And note the final one because it is the most telling request she made that morning. She wanted names. She wanted to know which members of staff had been inside that gallery, which is not the request of someone who wants a painting relocated. That is the request of someone who intends to deal with the people afterward in the manner she has dealt with people in that building for 25 years. They would not surrender the names either. For the first time in her entire royal career, Camilla was entirely powerless inside her own residence. And I want you to consider how unfamiliar that must have felt for her, because this is a woman who has spent 25 years being the person in that building whose preferences silently transformed into policy. Rooms were locked because she wanted them locked. Flowers were burned because she wanted them eliminated. Portraits disappeared from walls without anyone ever documenting an instruction, and she had just discovered that a palace which can be restructured around one woman can be restructured right back around another one, and that she possessed no authority to prevent it from happening. But the denied demands were not the most devastating part of that morning, not even close. The most devastating part was what transpired when she turned to her husband. Because Charles had spent decades fighting for this woman. Understand the magnitude of that before you assess his next action. He fought the institution for her. He fought the public who detested her for years and made no effort to hide it. He fought the press. He fought his own sons, both of whom told him to his face not to marry her. He spent 25 years being the one person in the entire world Camilla could depend on to stand up for her when no one else would. And now she was standing before him, humiliated and furious and trembling with it, waiting for him to pick up a phone and make this disappear the way he always had. He looked at her and he said nothing. That is it. He allowed his son's decisions to stand. He permitted his sister's actions to go entirely unchallenged. He did not make a single call. He did not raise one objection with anyone. He remained there, and he allowed Diana's portrait to remain on that wall. And you have to comprehend what a phone call would have cost him, because it was not much. He is the king. One sentence to a private secretary, and that painting comes off the wall by lunchtime, and the narrative never exits the building. Whatever legal foundation William had established, the sovereign requesting something within his own castle is not an insignificant force to contend with. He did not do it. He selected the most economical option available to himself, which was silence, and he presented his wife with the invoice. Palace insiders say that in that single moment, Camilla grasped something she had never in her life been compelled to confront directly. Charles had made his decision. He had chosen the institution. He had chosen his son. And after a lifetime of getting it wrong, he had chosen to finally honor the woman he had spent that lifetime wronging. And here is what renders his silence so much heavier than it appears on the surface. This is a man who, according to reporting that emerged recently, has been privately pleading with William not to marginalize Camilla after he passes. He knows exactly how profound his son's resentment runs. He has spent years attempting to contain that resentment with his own hands, requesting patience, requesting time, requesting one more year of peace. Sources close to the family have confirmed that William still harbors genuine, unresolved anger toward Camilla over what was inflicted upon his mother. One individual expressed it about as plainly as it can be expressed, which is that the manner in which Camilla betrayed Diana has not been forgotten by either of those sons, and that William has simply been more disciplined than Harry about concealing it. Charles is aware of all of it. He has always been aware of it, and when the moment finally arrived, he fell silent. That is not a husband failing to defend his wife in a dispute. That is a king seated in a room and accepting that the reckoning he had been holding at bay for 25 years had finally entered through the door, and there was nothing remaining to hold it back with. And then, just when Camilla believed she had already endured the worst thing that was going to happen to her that day, Princess Anne entered the room. Now this is the part I have been holding since the beginning, and I want to explain exactly why it matters before I reveal what she said. Nothing about this was included in the plan. William's entire operation was constructed to be silent. That was the fundamental design of it. No press release, no diary entry, no confrontation, no scene that anyone could photograph or quote or transform into a narrative about a family dispute. He had spent months making the thing legally watertight precisely so that it would never require defending verbally. It was supposed to be finished the moment that frame was mounted on the wall. Anne walking into a room to say it to Camilla's face was not part of that. No one scheduled it, no one authorized it. From what I understand, William learned it had occurred afterward, the same as everyone else. She came in person, face to face. No aides, no arranged witnesses, no one present to document it in a manner that could be tempered later. She looked at the woman who had burned Diana's flowers, who had sealed her bedroom, who had watched her portrait disappear from the walls for 20 years and never once inquired about where it had gone. And she spoke 5 words. She said, "It is what Diana deserved." Past tense this time. Deserved, not deserves, not is owed, not should have had. A declaration about a debt that had remained outstanding for 25 years and had just been settled in full by someone else. That is the whole of it. 5 words from a woman who has spent 70 years in that family mastering the art of not vocalizing what she thinks. And Camilla stood there and absorbed it, because there was nothing she could do with it. This is the one woman she has never been able to win over, never been able to charm, never been able to intimidate, never been able to make bow to her, not once, not even after the crown was placed on her head. And that woman had just walked into a room, informed her that her 25-year project had been dismantled because the other one deserved it, and walked back out. The story leaked. Of course it leaked, because 5 words in an empty room at Windsor Castle carry more value to a newspaper than any statement a press office has ever composed. And when it landed across the entire nation in a single morning. The painting was the strategy. The 5 words were the element no one anticipated, including the man who spent 20 years constructing the strategy. And what followed was not merely one dreadful morning for Camilla. It was the onset of a comprehensive and permanent restructuring of her standing within that family. She was quietly withdrawn from upcoming public engagements, not announced, not explained, simply erased from the schedule, the way things disappear when someone above has reached a decision. Royal patronages that Diana had established and championed began being reactivated under Catherine's office. If you have not encountered that term before, a patronage is the formal connection through which a royal supports a charity. And Diana's were never ornamental. She built hers around hospices and landmines and AIDS wards at a time when shaking a patient's hand without gloves generated front-page headlines. Charities Diana once devoted herself to began resurfacing in William's official schedule. And here's the figure that reveals everything about what was actually transpiring. The royal family's own communications referenced Diana's name more in the 2 weeks following that portrait going up than in the previous 2 years combined. That is not sentiment. That is a signal, and it is an unmistakable one, and it is institutional, and it does not reverse. The balance of power inside that household shifted, and everyone on the payroll recognized it simultaneously. Now let me place the final piece in position, because you cannot understand why William was ever going to do this without it. William has carried genuine, deep-seated resentment toward Camilla throughout his entire adult life. That is not a rumor, and it is not speculation. It is the thing everyone around him has been conveying quietly for 2 decades. One insider stated it plainly, that the way Camilla betrayed Diana has not been forgotten by William or by Harry, and that William has simply been more restrained than his brother about how he displays it. And we know Harry's version because Harry documented it and published it. In his memoir in January of 2023, he confirmed in writing that both brothers implored their father not to marry Camilla. Both of them. He recounted the two of them asking him not to proceed with it. He wrote about her in the language of a villain and a wicked stepmother. And he did it in a book that sold millions of copies in its first week. So both sons felt precisely the same way. They simply selected entirely different instruments. Harry chose to detonate publicly and accept the fallout. He said everything simultaneously to everyone and reduced his position in that family to the ground in the process. William chose patience. He chose the institution itself as the instrument. He waited until he possessed the power to wield it properly, mastered the rules thoroughly enough that no one could weaponize them against him, and then he moved once, decisively, at a moment of his own selection. And that is why Charles has been privately requesting that he not push Camilla aside after he is gone. Because Charles knows exactly what his son is. He knows that the instant William ascends that throne, every dimension of Camilla's public and private royal life gets reviewed, restructured, and determined by a man who has never once forgotten what she did to his mother, and who has now demonstrated in front of the entire nation that he is prepared to act on it. Diana's patronages are returning. The charities she constructed out of authentic devotion are being brought back into the light under Catherine's name and William's schedule. Diana's name is being spoken within official palace communications with a frequency and a depth of respect that has not existed since before she died. And the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor now displays her on its wall beside Queen Elizabeth. The two women who between them define the entire emotional core of the modern British monarchy, standing together at last on the wall where they always belonged. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. He made a promise to himself that day, and then he did the most difficult thing a furious person can do, which is absolutely nothing for 25 years, while he constructed the foundation beneath it so meticulously that no one could ever pull it out from under him. And when he was finally prepared, he enlisted the one person in that entire family possessing the standing and the history and the sheer audacity to make it permanent. Then, one quiet evening, while Camilla was asleep across London with no awareness whatsoever, the two of them escorted his mother back into the room she had always been owed. Diana would be proud of the man her son became. I believe that is the honest interpretation of all of this. And I believe anyone who observed that 15-year-old boy walking down the mall in 1997 would concur with it. But the person who has to exist within the aftermath is not him. Camilla spent 25 years getting that face off those walls. She burned the flowers. She sealed the bedroom. She packed away the possessions and kept the portrait in darkness for over 2 decades. And she genuinely believed it was finished. And now she has to walk past Diana every single day. in a house she thought she had conquered, in a family where her husband will not raise a finger for her, past a wall she is not permitted to touch, with 5 words from her sister-in-law trailing her down every corridor in that building for the remainder of her life. Thanks for watching. If you got something out of this one, hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.